do you want to kick us off?
Sounds good. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all today. I'm just joining you guys for the beginning of this exciting workshop this morning. Happy Monday morning to everyone. I'm Dr. Elise Demeter. I'm part of the Office of Assessment and Accreditation. I know a few of you from things like STEM Academy, for example. I've been working with Kathy and Tanya Bates for a while now on evaluating that program, so we can tell the whole world about the good things you've been doing in that program over the past couple of years. I run a research program out of the office on student learning and student success. And so I work through a lot of different areas, a lot with undergraduate education, advising and financial aid. And I also work with the graduate school on some projects focused on institutional policies surrounding authorship. So I do a lot of faculty development on things like student learning outcomes and aligning outcomes to assessments and activities that we do in our classrooms. And so I always love to have a chance to say hello to faculty who are participating in our summer scholarship of assessment grants. These have been really productive opportunities for people in the past. And so I hope that that continues to be the case this summer and that you all get a lot out of this experience and the work that you'll do next academic year. So I'm cheering you all on. It was wonderful to meet you. I'm going to jump off to another meeting, but I just wanted to say hello and feel free to reach out if I can be of help in any way to you guys.
Thanks, Elise.
All right. See you all.
See you later. So we thought we'd start off with the introductions of ourselves and also just sort of a broad overview of what most of you have signed up for, and we know that some of you are just drop-ins, but this is a new model for us, and I know a number of you have worked with us on scholarship of assessment grants in the past. And sorry, I'm just in, oh, there we go. And so in this model, we are essentially trying to create a cohort, and you guys are our sort of smaller cohort, and you're going to be part of the larger cohort for the 2 workshops after this. So this group of people are all interested in making a modification to their class that will hopefully support equity. And in our office, we're looking at equity and assessment, and we define that as essentially having all students have equal opportunity to show their learning. Right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a flat grade distribution. It means that your grade distribution is influenced by learning and not by other characteristics of the students. And so in this workshop, we're going to be focusing on giving you some of our thoughts about how you increase equity within assignments and assessments. And, you know, some people use those terms interchangeably, some people use them differentially. We're going to pretty much use them interchangeably. And we're going to be mostly focusing on your classroom assignments. And so today we're going to spend 2 hours doing that. We have a shared Google Doc that we'll be sharing with you a little bit later, where we're going to ask you to write your notes about what you want to take out of this meeting. And we purposefully have done that as a shared document because we want you to have the opportunity to see other people's thinking. And our goal for this new structure of these scholarship of assessment grants is to sort of create a learning community where you're benefiting from each other's thoughts and sense of community. A few weeks from now, we're going to be with the larger group, and that workshop is going to focus on how do you structure sort of educational intervention to maximize the opportunity for learning improvement. And so from this meeting, what you want to do is write down everything that you can think of that are sort of your raw ideas for learning improvement. And then in the next meeting, we're going to help you think about how you structure that optimally. And then I know that I reached out to everybody asking for alternate dates for our 3rd workshop, and I haven't gotten back to you. In the 3rd workshop, we are going to go ahead and schedule that in July. I believe the date that we had already had it scheduled. We know that your contracts end in June, and we deeply hope that you will choose to join us, although you will be off of contract. And what's going to happen in that session, we're going to meet in person, which we felt like was very valuable. And we also felt like having a little more time for you guys to move forward on things was important. And in that session, each of you is going to present your learning improvement plan, and we're going to workshop them. So everybody will have a couple minutes to present, and then everybody in the group is going to share thoughts about ways to make it a little bit better. And then next fall or spring, you will do your learning improvement, and pending funding, we will come back next summer to see how it went and go for further improvements. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Harriet, who's going to get us started there. Oh, one last thing. I'm sorry, Harriet. For those of you who have the bandwidth and don't mind, I think it would be super if you keep your video on as we're presenting, even when I share my screen. I know that when I'm presenting, I'll notice if you're sort of furrowing your brow and slow down. And I want that sense of community to evolve amongst us. And so, obviously, if you can't, don't, but if you can, please do. Now, Harriet.
Karen, would you like to go ahead and share your screen? So
Sure.
while Karen is doing that, I want to introduce myself. So good morning, everyone. We are super excited that you are contributing to the Scholarship of Assessment and have an interest in closing equity gaps in your class. My name is Harriet Hobbs, and I work in the Office of Assessment and Accreditation. And in my role, I work with folks about accreditation. So we are actually in the process of being reaccredited in a couple of years. And then also my experience is with student learning, institutional effectiveness, and strategic planning. So again, thank you so much for being a part of today's workshop. So on the next slide, this is a test slide. And so what we would like for you to do here is to pull out your electronic device, or you can pull out your, or you can use your laptop. And what we like for you to do is introduce yourself. As you're introducing yourself, type in the word, what comes to mind when you think about equity and assessment. So on your laptop or computer, go to polev.com, enter Karen Singer F601 and respond to the activity. If you're using your cell phone, text 22233, and in the body of the text, type in Karen Singer F601. And so as you're doing that, if you've done it already, if you could just take a moment and introduce yourself, your name, state your name, your college, and your discipline.
My name is Monica Sahani. I am in the College of Health and Human Services, and I primarily teach in public health, but my specialization is global health, infectious diseases, and health systems. And I have a small issue with the internet connection this morning, so I'm trying not to get on the video, but as soon as the repairman gives the green signal, I'll turn on the video.
One more thing, Monica, before we go to the next person, could each person also just share the class they think they might be modifying? Because that'll be helpful to me and Harriet as we're going through.
I think I would like to modify it for my lower level global health course, but I am very looking forward to the skills that I learned in this workshop. If I could, after implementing it for my global health class and seeing the results, I might even go ahead and use those skills for other classes.
Would anyone else like to take themselves off mute and introduce themselves? State your name, college, discipline, and the course that you would like to.
I'll go. I think I just sent my text right. I hope so. My name is Angela Mitchell, and I'm the director of first year writing, which is, gen ed course. I'm in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies. And with my colleague, Amy, I'm looking at ways we can create equity in our assessment practices for our first year writing courses 1103 and 1104.
I guess I'll just go next because Angela sort of summed up what we were doing, but my name's Amy Colombo. I'm a lecturer in the Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies department. It's a class, and I'm going to be working with Angela, and the courses I'm thinking about are words 1103 and 1104.
Awesome. And as you're typing in your words, type as many words as you like. I don't think we've heard from everybody.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I was talking earlier, but no one heard me. I'm Ellen Wisner. I'm from the CLAS. I'm in the Department of Biological Sciences. And the class that I'm thinking of working with is my ecology class. And that's in part because I'm teaching it both in the fall and the spring. So I thought it would be nice to be able to try something out and then try it again in the spring.
Good morning. My name is Paris Coleman. I'm not with a college right now. I actually work for housing. And I'm here, by the way, just in case I have to, go give someone a key or something. But I recently earned my postmaster's certification in university and college teaching. And I developed 2 courses for the program for my class for assignments. I did a public speaking course, and I taught UCall 1300 last year. So I created a course for another class project as well. So I'm here to learn as much as I can to develop those courses that I created to hopefully use them in the future.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Smallenberger. I'm in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences in the Math and Stats department. The course that I want to focus on is my introductory statistics course that a lot of first and second year students take.
Okay, Karen, I think we've heard from everybody. Awesome. Okay, so yes, absolutely. Equity, assessment, fairness. And so these are definitely, you're spot on in terms of when you think about equity and assessment, what does it mean to you? Labor, testing, assessing students. Absolutely. So again, this was a test slide. So now we're going to move on to the next slide. So why do we, as faculty members and assessment practitioners, assess learning? So again, type in as many words as you like, using poll everywhere. Absolutely. Yes, teaching, feedback, understanding, memory, absolutely, that prior knowledge, right? Comprehension, grades, measures, absolutely. So you are right on to support learning. So why do we assess learning? As professors, right, you are constantly thinking deeply about what type of work you want your students to do. For example, do you want your students, what is it that we want them to know, think, and do, and demonstrate that they have achieved learning in our class? And Susky talks about that on why do we assess learning? What skills should they have? What skills are missing? What type of activities should they be able to do? Also, is prior knowledge present about the content, or is there a mix of students who have prior knowledge and others who do not have prior knowledge? So essentially, we evaluate our students to determine what they know, what they need to know in terms of the course content. It is also important too that we learn about our students. And this is going beyond learning their names, right? So we ask our students, why are you taking this course and what do you hope to get out of this course? And I think it's important too, as we learn about our students, some students, they're a first generation of college students. So it's important to them that they're first in their college to graduate. And then also we want to teach students, right? So how do we know how to teach our students if we aren't learning about our students? And then also as we teach our students, It informs what we know about our programs. It could be that there are some prerequisites that may be misaligned or co-requisites. So this helps us in terms of evaluating our programs.
Harriet, do you mind if I just add a couple of thoughts?
Absolutely.
So, you know, also when we're learning about our students, one thing that we can learn about our students, which is going to be a focus for our group over the next couple months, is what are their barriers to success. So when a student makes a mistake on an assignment, that's a moment for us to reflect. Does that mistake reflect competence, or is there something about the assignment that might be faulty that's leading to that error? And so, you know, when you give assignments back, really being open to listening to students when they say, yeah, but isn't this also a right answer? Or yeah, but you know, you didn't make that clear. So that's one moment we learn about our students. And then also we're going to be thinking a lot about really subtle barriers that may be cultural or modality related. And so when students tell us about their lived experiences, one thing that I'm going to be talking about later is the value of reflection assignments. And if you ask students to say, relate something to their life, that's a really golden opportunity for us to learn from that assignment, so that when we lecture on that topic in the future, we can relate whatever the concept is directly to a group of students in the class's lived experience, right? So you can say explicitly in a lecture in future years, I know from reading students' writings about this, that you know, within this culture or within this group, this concept is really important for this reason, right? So those are moments you learn about your students. And then also in terms of teaching students, we never have students' attention as tightly as when we are evaluating them. Right? So assignments, grades motivate students deeply. And so every time you put something in a graded assignment, you're getting students' attention to that concept in a much more focused way than anything that you don't put in an assignment. So when you're thinking about what you want students to retain from a class, really intentionally giving students assignments, you know, even really easy multiple choice questions, for example, that are gift questions, true false questions about something you really want them to remember, is going to increase the odds that they're going to remember that in the future. That's called the testing effect. Back to you, Harriet.
Okay, so I think we're moving on to the next slide. So what Karen and I explain is from our perspective, right? So from a faculty and assessment practitioner, why do we assess students? But now let's switch gears and then let's think about it from a student point of view. So why do students complete assessment? So let's go to Poll Everywhere again and type in as many words as you like from the point of a student perspective. Absolutely, grades. Think, because credit, yes. Proof to learn, think, absolutely. Grades, yes. So Karen, you can go on for credit. You can move on to the next slide. And so you are spot on again in terms of how students complete assignments to earn a grade. And so we recently published an article that was published actually on Friday in Assessment Update. And Karen, if you don't mind, you can put that in the chat for the group, the link to the article. And in the article, we talked about the importance of disaggregating grades by assignment types. But more importantly, students do complete assignments to earn a grade. And so we're going to talk about too, how low grades can reduce students' sense of academic self-efficacy, which can have long-term reductions in their academic success. Students also complete assignments to learn about the content as well as themselves. And so assessment for learning focuses on opportunities that students can develop to be able to evaluate themselves, to make judgments about their own performance, and to improve upon those improvements or those areas of concern. And then students complete assignments to foster a number of skills, such as reflection, critical thinking, as well as self-awareness. Karen, did you want to add anything there? If not, we can move on to the next slide. And so why equity? And so there is a broader conversation within the higher educational landscape about social justice. For example, what comes to mind is Gordon et al., who's a scholar in the field, elucidate that social justice issues are particularly important in higher education because there is a societal need for diversity in education and global understanding for our students. And moreover, this expectation has grown following recent protests and advocacy movements across campuses in the nation. And so there are many scholars who are contributing to the field. Tia McNair at AAC&U, which is the American Association of Colleges and Universities, as well as Gavin Henning, who's also contributing to the field of social justice, as well as assessment in higher education. And our very own Christine and Karen, they are leading the efforts on a project called Grand Challenges for Assessment in Higher Education. And as a result of that project, using assessment findings to increase equity has been identified as a grand challenge in higher education. And so equity is important for teaching experiences. So as faculty members, you have or had first-generation college students in your class, underrepresented minority students, and transfer students in your courses. So it is important to understand and acknowledge and to learn about diverse students to ensure that everyone, regardless of their race, gender, identity, disability, family background, or income, have access to educational resources as well as educational rigor. And as I mentioned before, this work is important, equity work for scholarly work. So as I previously mentioned, there are many scholars in the field who are contributing to the societal need for diversity education. And so now I am going to turn it over to Karen.
Great. And before I move to the next slide, I also just want to have you for a second just think about your own teaching experiences, because I know, what brought me to this work was this discomfort in my classes with feeling like not all students from all groups were having equal opportunities to succeed. And, I'm going to be talking to you later about student feelings of self-efficacy, but professorial feelings of self-efficacy, to whatever extent your identity is wrapped up in your ability to teach, failing to teach all students equally damages your own sense of self-efficacy. And so I know that for myself, the more I focused on finding ways to give every student the very best opportunity to succeed, the better I felt about myself as a teacher. And I think that's especially true at an institution like UNC Charlotte, where if we're going to feel really good about our institution, one of the best things our institution does is provide a high quality education to students that might not have access to it otherwise, as a relatively accessible undergraduate degree. So that's sort of why I care about creating equitable assessments. We're going to do one more poll everywhere, and then we're going to move on from that. If you can just sort of type the single words about why do you care? And as you're doing this, keep track of them, because this is going to be hard work we're going to ask you to do over the next year. And so remembering sort of what's motivating you to do the work, like really motivating you, I think is pretty critical. Dreams, harming students, fairness, challenge, communication, evaluation, fairness. Yeah, back when I was a faculty member and I'd be in my department meetings, I would always say, well, if we make this change to our curriculum, how many student lives are we going to ruin? And so I like that harming word that came up, sort of, I hope it meant like avoiding harm. So moving on. When I think about why we need to have equitable assessments, I think there's sort of three levels to think about this. And I think the first one, if we're thinking about it from a sort of systems perspective, is that local student success and retention. So, you know, every class a student gets a D, F, or W in is going to slow down their graduation. It's going to make it less likely that they maintain their financial aid, and that's increasingly true as financial aid rules have tightened. And it's going to make it less likely they're going to get their college degree, and they're going to get their college degree in the major that they originally chose. So we know students leave majors in droves, especially those of you in STEM. But then the second reason is, even if a student passes our class with, say, a C- or a D, and even if that grade is enough to let them move on in the major, we've contributed to the student's vision of themselves as a student. And if their understanding is a C- or a D, that can be an important lesson, right? That they need to work harder, they need to do better. But if their real understanding is actually a B or an A, and we've given them a C or a D, we've made a chink in their view of themselves as an intellect and as a student. And I would say that's unethical. So being really sure, you know, it's easy. We all know the professor who says they grade papers by weighing them, right? Being really sure you're not that professor that is just throwing out grades because that's your job. You want to get to your research or the end of the semester, but really being sure that the way you design your assignments and the way you grade your assignments is trying to get to the truth. I used to be an X-Files fan, and, you know, the truth is out there. The truth of student understanding is in there. And it's our job to make sure that we are evaluating that properly so that the vision a student is getting of themselves matches reality. Because when a student feels like there's a disconnect between their true understanding and their measured understanding, that makes them feel like they're being rejected and they're an outsider, and things that can affect their retention, even if their grades are okay. We know that a lot of, I've done a lot of work in STEM, but STEM students are likely to leave STEM majors even when they're passing in their first year, because they'll get A's in their English classes and C's in their STEM classes, and they view those grades as diagnostic of their future in the field. And you know, as I said, it also is going to influence your sense of self-efficacy as a teaching faculty member. And then finally, it's student sense of belonging. When a student sits in a room and gets a poor grade or gets a not nice comment on a paper, that communicates to the student that they don't belong. And if a student has privilege, they can weather that, right? Oh yeah, you say I don't belong. Like my son, very privileged, and he'd be like, that mean, stupid professor didn't even see my brilliance, you know? So, you know, some people are Teflon, and in general, males tend to be a little more Teflon than females. And students who are not first generation, not from communities that are underrepresented in higher education, don't have disabilities, are first language speakers, all of them are going to be more resistant to negative feedback. But the students who have any area of perceived weakness themselves are way more likely to take that negative feedback and use it in a self-diagnostic way to say they don't belong in the major or in higher ed or whatever. So now, to do this work, we need to take the perspective of how students see our work, because most of us have been on the grading end for way too long. At least I have, I'm old. So what I want you to do is think back through your whole life, going back to kindergarten, and think about the best assignment you've ever completed. And you might want to write it down for yourself so you remember as you're moving through and doing this work. And then I'll give you a minute. I always rush too much. Now that you've thought of that assignment, I want you to think about what made it the best assignment. So why did it rise to the top? What made it memorable? What emotions are evoked when you think about the assignment? And how has it influenced you? And now you're going to go onto your poll everywhere and just write the words in. that answers those questions.
Karen, a couple things. Can you also go back to the previous slide so I can take a look at those questions?
They're all up
or-
here at the top, actually. So the best assignment
Oh,
you ever
perfect.
completed, what made it memorable?
And then this is for an assignment that we completed as students.
Yes.
Okay.
And
Karen,
Monica, did
I-
you have a question?
Karen, did I hear it correct that an assignment we completed as a student or an assignment we created as a faculty?
No, as a student. And I know it's hard, right?
Oh my goodness, it's like I have to really let my age know now. I have to think about the last assignment.
I made myself do this also, so. I never ask something of my students that I don't try myself. But I mean, I think the fact that it's hard shows you how distant you are from it. And I think the key to doing some of the work we're going to ask you to do is to get yourself a little closer to what it felt like to be a student. So I'm looking for like at least 3 words from everybody. What made it memorable? How did it make you feel? And how did it influence you? I don't know, Angela, is it possible that, are you doing it by text or by email?
I'm doing it by text. Karen,
When I
so,
tried, you have to text to the number. So you put that in the address and then the message is the Karen Singer-Freeman or Karen Singer F.
Oh, so the number is what I text to.
Yeah, I made the mistake too. So you text to this number and then the message is Karen Singer F 601.
I see. I'm sorry.
Don't be. This is the first time I've ever used Poll Everywhere. And I, for like 3 hours last week, was like, why isn't it showing up? But it was lucky because now I know how to answer your problem.
Thank you.
Okay, so project monitoring, outcome, game, sense, healthcare, artistic, happy, memorable, fun, curious, excited, applicable, practice, theory, opportunities. Cool. Do people need another minute or are we ready to move on? When I think about the best assignment I ever created, it was I took this biological psychology class as an undergraduate, and we had to challenge scientific theories. And I challenged the theory of concealed ovulation. And it was the first time I ever actually felt like I did really independent new thinking. And I was like super proud of myself. And there were very clear instructions about what I needed to do. But the big thing was this, it was the first time as an undergraduate, I really encountered this idea that I was entitled to think hard and make a really strong argument against papers. And it was very memorable for me. So now I've sometimes been accused of being glass half empty kind of person. So I purposely started with what did we like about an assignment, but now think about the worst assignment you ever completed. Your mission, should you choose to accept it. And then we're going to be answering the same questions. What made it the worst? What made it memorable? What emotions were evoked? How did it influence you? And here we go. Lots of shame. Confusion. Yeah, so, I think this is really interesting. This is the first time I've done this activity in a workshop. But when I asked you about the best assignment, there was no agreement, right? There was lots of distributed positive experiences. And I think that's really an important thing for us to keep in mind, because I think Harriet and I would argue that any assignment structure you can make the best, right? Even a test could be made into the best assignment somebody created. But when I asked you about the worst, confusion and shame and exams, but confusion and shame are the two big things that came out. And I don't think you guys are unique in that. And I think it's really important to remember that no matter how a student presents when you give them their bad assignment back, the odds are that on some level they're feeling confusion and shame. And I have a few worst assignments, but one of my worst assignments was in 8th grade. I had to write my first formal essay. And the teacher just said to me, you need to have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And I confused conclusion with like the thank yous that take place in books, acknowledgements. And so for the end of my paper, I wrote like a thanks to my parents for raising me, and this whole thing. And the teacher gave it back with this, this is ridiculous type of a comment, without at all speaking to the fact that, I just totally did not know what to do, and nobody in that school had ever taught me what I was supposed to do. And that led to a lot of feelings of shame and embarrassment, so that I remember it to this day. So we want to try and avoid that in our students. We want students maybe not to always do well on assignments, but we want them not to feel confused by our assignments and not to feel ashamed when we give back our assignments. Let's see if I can move forward. Okay, so now what we all have been waiting for, we're going to start thinking about our assignments. And what I would encourage you to do right now is think about the assignment that maybe you think might have gaps in grades that don't reflect ability, right? So gaps that might be inequitable based on something other than ability, because I will argue that any gap in grades that doesn't reflect ability is an equity gap. So once you've thought of that assignment, I want you to, on just some note paper, I'm going to go through 5 or 6 statements. And if you think students would believe that statement very much described that assignment, write a 3, a little bit a 2, and not at all a 1. So for example, if you think your assignment is really very likely to result in something a student would discuss with others, give it a 3. If they might a little bit discuss it with others, a 2. And if you don't think they want to discuss it with others at all, give it a 1. We're all good with this? Helps me understand myself better. Improve my understanding of important concepts. And notice that's improves, not measures, right? Provides me with experience that will be professionally useful. Has personal value. Monica, did you have a question?
No.
Okay, yeah, I think your hand is still up, but maybe that's.
Oh
from
my
before.
goodness. I am so sorry, Karen. I've
That's
been
okay.
having some internet issues. I'm back and forth getting my server updated. So
Okay. So when we think about these questions, does anybody have a sense of what these are measuring? You can just unmute yourself.
I guess it would be what students value.
Good. So, right, we're asking you to think about from a student perspective, and value is a really key word there. What types of value do you think are being measured? Because this is a construct that we've sort of created that has 3 subunits to it, or sub-constructs.
I think in my experience, I don't want to sound like a glass half empty, but in my 12 years of being a full-time faculty, I think I could say I have met less than 1% of the students who really, really want to learn. My experience has been, whether I submitted or not, whether I did well or not, whether I learned anything or not, just give me my A and I'm out of the thing. So that is one of the biggest challenge I have had. I would say in my 12 years of academic career, 1% of, or even less, would have come and said, I know the finals are done. Like this semester, I did have a student who emailed me, I know I got an A in your class, the finals are done, but I still didn't understand how I got these 2 answers wrong. Can you please tell me? So only less
So
than 1%.
Monica is making the point that it's hard potentially to get students to feel that assignments help their understanding of important concepts. And definitely that's true. There's some things that are easier to achieve than others, but I want to bring our focus back here to what is it that these are measuring. And so Angela said value, and that's correct. There's a broad concept called utility value, which was proposed in the 1970s by Jacqueline Eccles. And utility value is the extent to which a student views an experience as having value to them. And so broadly, you can think about utility value as sort of, if a student would want to discuss something with somebody else, then that's maybe sort of a general marker of value. Within utility value, there's these 3 sub-constructs. So personal utility value, we're measuring with helps me understand myself better or has personal value. Can anybody think about a sort of assignment that might lead a student to say that the assignment helped them understand themselves better or had personal value?
I think some of the writing assignments that I give where they have to work in groups. So I think some of the personal values is, you know, I am not good at working with group, but this assignment helped me, you know, work around people's schedule, you know, be a leader in certain aspects of the assignments and take responsibilities. Even when I was not at fault, I have to be responsible for my whole group's thing. So I think some of these have come up.
Great. And you know, what you're actually raising is anything that challenges students in an area that they have perceived weakness can help them feel like they understand themselves better. So along the same lines, giving an oral presentation, students sometimes can feel like has personal value because they know that they're nervous about speaking in public. And if we think about helping students realize the personal utility value, when you actually say to students, think about how work in this group project helped you develop group skills, and you maybe even say, you know, that's something that employers value a lot. And so you want to remember that. That's going to help students think about your assignment in that way.
So Karen, in the chat, there are some interesting comments. Amy said reflection assignments.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, literacy narrative by Angela. Paris said personal speeches. So they
Yeah.
point you to earlier. And questions that prompt students to reflect on how this material relates to their life.
Yeah, all of those are excellent examples. I hope you can't hear my cat meowing in the background. I apologize. Michael?
Yeah, just a question. It seems like there would be, because the part of this, what we're talking about is that students want to talk about these assignments. It seems like there would be different forms of talk about assignments, right? It would be one like, oh, you know, I saw this statistics thing come up in this news article that I read the other day. But then there would also be a different form that would just say, hey, how did you guys do question number 5? Right? So can you maybe talk a little bit about the different forms of speech or how that would relate to this?
Yeah, we tried to focus it not on speech around a task, but on speech about a task by saying results in something I will discuss with others. So if you're talking about how to do question 5 while you're doing it, that wouldn't be covered by this if you were reading this prompt very carefully. You certainly could misunderstand it that way. But if you felt like that question 5 that you struggled with was a key concept you needed to, do well in statistics or within your major, and so after you did poorly on it, you wanted to discuss it with others to find out what you did wrong, then it would qualify. Does that clarify a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit. I guess the thing that I'm trying to also wrap my head around is if there is kind of like the discussion that came up earlier about group projects, if somebody all of a sudden does take the lead, but then the lead morphs into simply just sharing answers, then of course within the group there's going to be like, oh, you're a lifesaver, and of course that's going to kind of speak to their efficacy. But I'm just still processing this. Can you maybe talk about how because that would, I don't know, does that lead to resulting in something that they're discussing? I'm just not sure yet.
Yeah, well, what I'm going through here is actually this measure that we created that you can use with your students to evaluate your assignments if you want next year. So these 5 questions together make up the construct of utility value. And so they give you sort of a rough view of how students are responding, or you can look at individual questions. So like, let's say you decide you're going to try and really boost the personal utility value, or actually, I'm sorry, there's 6, the professional utility value. Then you can give students this measure next year and see how they respond to those questions. But all of these things, the more you get students wanting to talk to each other around an assignment, that actually boosts something called social pedagogy. So if you can, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, so I actually won't go into that here. So the research hasn't actually gone to the granular level of whether boosting personal utility value makes more of a difference than professional utility value, but there's pretty good research that has shown. So for example, Harakowitz in a introductory biology class at University of Wisconsin at Madison randomly assigned thousands of intro bio students to one of 2 conditions. In one condition, they had to write 3 essays where they had to explain a biological concept. And then in the second condition, the only difference was they had to write those same 3 essays, but they had to explain the biological concept. Oh, so in the first, it was explain the biological concept and how it's important to biology. And then the second condition was explain the biological concept and explain how it's important to you or people you care about. And just writing those 3 essays caused students to have, it was first generation and underrepresented ethnic minority students who were in both of those groups. Their grades improved in that class when they wrote those essays where they were relating the content to their own lives. So that's like the best study. And I know I went over that kind of quickly, but we're going to argue that thinking about utility value within your assignments, and I'm going to end today's workshop going through some really specific suggestions of ways you can boost utility value, is a good way to reduce equity gaps. So personal utility value, academic utility value, I think we think about a lot in terms of improving understanding. But a key thing that I want to underline here is when we talked about why we measure or why we assess students, mostly it was for assessment purposes. And it's really critical to recognize that our assessments are a really strong learning opportunity. And so when you do, if you think about Bloom's taxonomy, when your assessments are at a higher level of Bloom's taxonomy, so you're asking students to relate one concept to another concept, or relate what they've learned in this class to what they learned in a prerequisite class, that's a really strong learning opportunity that I think oftentimes we aren't taking advantage of. And I think people think about moving higher on Bloom's taxonomy as a way to separate out A's from B's. But if you can design assignments at higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, so those bigger reaches between content areas with enough support for students to succeed, right? So you have to bootstrap them or scaffold them to being able to do those more difficult assignments. You don't want them to be the A versus B assignments. You want them to be the sort of deep learning assignments. And then professional utility value tends to be extremely compelling, especially to first generation or low income students. Because oftentimes those students are hearing from their family, you know, we're spending all this money on university, what good is it? And so when you say to a student, this skill that you're going to practice in this assignment can be something to put on a resume, or is going to help you get a job, a good job this summer, or when you graduate, that's going to draw their attention and effort in a really powerful way. Any other questions about this before I move on? I want to be sure we have enough time to get to the applications part. Oh, so, you know, if you wanted to think of what's the image about utility value, I used to like these little Miss and Mr. books. I don't know if you guys did, but your assignment should try to be helpful, right? So when you are thinking about yourself as an assessor, try and channel little Miss Helpful, not little Mr. Grumpy or little Mr. Critical. Because oftentimes, you know, like I find it really painful giving student writing feedback when students are poor writers. And I have to like have little Miss Helpful on my computer in front of me because I want to be crabby and I want to say like, you know, I've told you that you have to finish contrastive phrases 74 times and why are you still not doing it, right? But the more we channel in our instructions and in our feedback that idea that the assignments help students learn and don't judge students, the less likely we are to evoke something called stereotype threat, where students who feel a lack of privilege or a lack of sense of belonging are that feeling of judgment actually interferes with their ability to show us what they know. Okay, so now think about the same assignments, and we're going to do the same thing with these sentences. Allows me to express my learning in my own words. Makes me feel confident I can succeed. Includes familiar examples and materials. Measures my true understanding. Allows me to relate class materials to my experiences. And includes clear instructions. Any idea what this is measuring?
Would it be efficacy?
Expand on that a little bit.
So these are qualities that a student would make the student feel as if they could succeed.
You're absolutely on the right track. Yeah. Does anybody else have other thoughts about it? And I'm monitoring the chat now. I learned my lesson. So when we were creating this measure, we came up with this idea of calling it inclusive content. And I liked Angela's idea of self-efficacy. Inclusive content is a term that's used a lot when people are talking about equity and assessment. And oftentimes it's really narrowly defined to be picking materials that come from different cultural or ethnic groups or are reflective of the diversity in your class. And we picked inclusive content because we believe inclusive content goes well beyond that. And in fact, I believe that sometimes when faculty try and use inclusive content, they're inadvertently excluding some other group, right? So unless you let students in your class select the content they're going to display their learning on, it's very hard to have content that's equally inclusive to everybody, you know, in terms of like what book you're reading or what example you're using on a test. And selecting examples from across the spectrum, it just means that everybody's going to be equally excluded, right? Which is progress. But if we think about the diversity of our students in a very broad way, and then we think about these terms. So for example, expressing learning in my own words. If you're thinking about whether your assignments are inclusive in this way, think about whether the words you're requiring are words that were taught in your class or a prerequisite class, or are they words that come from a privileged class, right? So are you expecting in students' writing them to use sort of high-level common English vernacular types of terminology, even if that doesn't have anything to do with your teaching? Or are you allowing them to write in whatever linguistic style they're familiar with, as long as they express the true concepts? And, you know, oftentimes I think students feel really caught because we say, don't plagiarize, right? Don't directly quote, but then we slam them if their prose isn't elegant. And so you have to think really hard. If you are an English teacher, like Angela and Amy, maybe teaching them a certain style of writing is what you are teaching them, and then that's right to expect it. If you're teaching them statistics or public health or biology, then, you know, we need to be really careful about that. Students feel confident they can succeed when they're given the instructions and the background material that enable them to succeed. And so again, we have to think, if you haven't taught everything, even if you're relying on something that was a prerequisite to your class, but you know that half your class are transfer students who took it somewhere else, then to make students feel confident, providing them with links to back up material, right? Saying right up front in the assignment, these are the things you need to know to do this assignment. And if you want to brush up, here's where you can go. And, you know, we all now have treasure troves of video content after COVID-19. So making use of them can boost students' confidence that they can succeed. Also, you know, thinking really hard about why would you choose to grade on a curve? Right? I mean, I am so troubled by curve grading because it implies that it only matters how well somebody masters material relative to their classmates, as opposed to the fact that there is actually out there in the world excellence. And when you say to students, no matter how well you do, if your neighbor does better than you, then you are invoking that feeling of competition and threat and judgment, as opposed to saying right up front, I am never happier than when everybody gets an A in my class, right? And if you do everything that you need to master this material, you will get an A, right? That expressing your confidence in their ability to succeed, I think is critical. And again, especially for students, for whatever reason, who lack that sense of privilege and ownership in the classroom, including familiar materials. We want to think when we select examples, are these examples really familiar to some subset of our students, but not all of our students? But again, I think it's a slippery slope, because you can never, unless you let students select their materials, which you can, it's really hard to find materials that are equally familiar to everybody in the class. But using materials that you've exposed students to, right? So things you've talked about in lecture as opposed to things that you haven't, is one way to sort of do that. This all comes together in measuring my true understanding. Relating materials to my experience, I think, is a little bit more off to the side. And then including clear and detailed instructions. I oftentimes have worked with faculty who are like, oh, well, I want students to be creative. And that's fine if you really are going to grade students allowing the full range of their creativity. But 90% of the time when I work with a faculty member who says they don't give detailed instructions because they want students to use their creativity, when you actually look at how they're grading the assignments, they are looking for something quite specific, and they're marking students down when they don't show that. And so as you do your grading, you have to think really hard, where am I taking points off? And, you know, I used to, every time I would grade assignments, I would add details to my instructions for those assignments for the next year, where I would specifically say, you know, you have to do this, because I would realize, and, you know, if I was really being my fairest, which I wasn't all the time, I wouldn't take points off the first time, right? Because I'd say, and, you know, I would do, like, if a quarter of your class doesn't do something, you have to start to think, did I make it clear that they needed to do that? Questions, comments, thoughts on this one before we move on? Okay, so you pull these things together, and Harriet is going to talk about a matrix that we've created of culturally relevant pedagogy. And that's what, you know, we are happy for you to make any interventions, but that's really what the focus of this workshop is going to be on. And I meant assessment. Sorry.
Thank you, Karen. So Karen spent a great deal of time discussing the constructs of utility value and inclusive content. Now, these two were the impetus of a first article that we wrote. It was entitled A Theoretical Matrix of Culturally Relevant Assessment. And so in the article, we hypothesized that these two elements of assignments, the lack of these elements, can perpetuate equity gaps. But since the article, we revised and focused on high utility value and inclusive content, which limits the effects of prior knowledge and privilege. And so Karen explained high utility value. And so essentially, high utility value is that the assignment has meaning to the student beyond the context of a grade. And this could include professional. How can this relate to me as a student from the lens of a professional? And personal as well as academic. So academic is how can this skill that I'm learning in this class build upon the next course? And so, for example, professional utility value is where students will see that the value is useful in their professional career. And so academic utility value fosters skills that help students succeed in a current or future course. And so personal utility value is providing content within the assignment that the students consider relevant to helping them better understand themselves. And so the last element of CRA, which is culturally relevant assessment, is inclusive content. And as Karen indicated, inclusive content limits the effects of prior knowledge and privilege. And so in inclusive content, it considers assignments that are aligned with teaching and learning. And so anytime we test students on content that we haven't taught, we are disproportionately harming those students who have less preparation and have less confidence. So we must be sure that assignments are aligned with teaching and learning outcomes that we are trying to achieve. So therefore, if assessment or teaching is poorly aligned, it will definitely increase equity gaps in student learning. And so let's talk about accessible materials. So this refers to textbooks, the cost of textbooks or other required materials in the course. So when textbooks or additional resources in the course are used instead of open educational resources, students who have limited economic resources may not buy the book at all, or they may wait till later in the semester. And the lack of accessible materials have been found to have serious implications for students' ability to successfully complete the course. And so let's talk about clear instructions. We must be sure to include clear, detailed instructions in the assignments. When instructions are unclear, students who have stronger academic preparation will more likely be able to understand the instructor's intention because they have previous experience with similar assignments. So therefore, students from privileged groups will feel more comfortable raising their hands, asking for clarification, while historically underrepresented groups may not feel as comfortable asking for clarification. And so another element is scaffolding. Now, scaffolding consider assignments. This means that you're providing students early on in the course with an opportunity to build on knowledge and competencies that they practice in early assignments. So again, scaffold assignments include detailed prompts with clear instructions that allow all students to succeed. And scaffold assignments help students have early success in the course and can build trust and help students to persist when assignments become more rigorous. And then the last is inclusive content. And this is an environment that does not promote stereotype threat. A stereotype threat describes situations in which individuals believe that they are at risk to conforming to negative stereotypes about their group. And so still et al. Posit that stereotypes can threaten how students evaluate themselves, which alters their academic identity and their intellectual performance. An inclusive environment also includes having diverse faculty and teachers supporting the class. So in summary, high utility value has meaning beyond the academic context. Inclusive content limits the effects of prior knowledge when students receive all the information they need to succeed on all assignments, and therefore all students have equal access to succeed. So again, in contrast, if instructions are incomplete or some expectations are unstated and students have completed similar assignments in their previous class, they will benefit from their past experiences where other students may be at a disadvantage. So now, are there any questions? If not, we're going to turn it over to Karen to discuss the types of assignments that are at risk of producing equity gaps. But I'm going to pause and see if there's some questions about the elements of culturally relevant assessment. Okay, Karen, take it away.
Somebody saying something?
Well, it wasn't me before. I don't want to cut anyone off. And you may get to this, Karen. And so, but one of the things that I was thinking about is gosh, I completely lost it. I'm sorry. I'll put it in the chat if it comes to me. It's totally gone.
Here, let me ask a question then, and then maybe that'll help you get a second to jog your memory. Harriet, when you talked about accessible materials, you mentioned economically not being able to afford these materials. Was that just one of the bullet points that falls under accessible materials, or is like a disability related accessibility also within that category?
That's an excellent question, Michael. It's one of the sub-bullets that fall under accessible materials. And so that's a good point. We need to think about that too. It's disability. So what have been identified in the students, and I don't know if we call it an IEP plan at UNC Charlotte, but what could that be an impact? So ensuring that we are providing an opportunity for students to have access to those materials.
And even the language that materials are written in, I still remember taking all of my undergraduate and graduate statistics courses. And, you know, there would be a whole page of text, which I wouldn't understand a word of, getting to the formula. And then I know some of the, you know, like online best practices statistics resources now, when you look at them, it's like one sentence of simple explanation prior, and this is when you use it, and this is why it's relevant prior to the formula. And so I think oftentimes, you know, we don't even think about, you know, on the one hand, you would say college students should have college level reading abilities. But when a text is written in college level reading abilities, especially in something, for example, like mathematics, you're using up so much of people's mental effort with the reading, especially students who don't have college level reading ability yet, that you're drawing their ability to think about the concepts. So finding materials that are as simple in their writing as possible to allow people's working memory to focus on the concepts is another really key piece of accessibility.
And I want to point out, I know we got to move on, Karen, but I want to address Michael's point too. So Michael, I do believe too, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, that the university do cover costs for students that have disabilities, so if they need certain materials, but also some students are embarrassed about their disability, so that could be like a sidebar conversation, maybe with an advisor. But good point.
Any other questions or comments before we move on?
Well,
We're
my-
moving into talking about how this all really applies to assignments. So we will.
And that's probably more my question, but I'm sort of, one of the problems that I see is that daily work, homework, low stakes assignments that final products are related to seem to have, that's where I see my students' grades slipping often. And so kind of trying to figure out how to help them value those lower stakes assignments is something that I really want to be able to focus on. In our field, there's a big emphasis on labor grading, but I find that on that daily, in the daily way, that's bringing my students' grades down. So I'll be interested to hear what you say about.
That's an excellent point, Angela. I'm gonna make one comment. I know we have to move on from time. I think that's where scaffolding come in. As you communicate to the student that, hey, we're learning this skill early on in the course, and you're gonna apply this skill in midterm at the final project. So really getting students to see how, oh, it's just not a one and done, how it's gonna build on and then scale up to the final project.
One other thought about that is in our original measure of utility value, we had an item which was I do this assignment primarily for a grade, and that one topped out, right? So everybody gave it the highest possible rating, and we removed it. It didn't intercorrelate with any of the other abilities, but it speaks to a really important thing, which all of us know, which is the number one motivating factor for students are their grades. And when they see low stakes assignments, even though there's a lot of research that shows that having frequent low stakes assignments builds students' academic self-efficacy, it can improve their grades in that course and other courses. What everybody sees all the time is that our students oftentimes who are most likely to not make it through our classes are also not doing those assignments. And I had a bit of a eureka moment when Christine Robinson, our office director, said how sometimes her son just says, well, I'm not going to sweat the small stuff. You know, that's just worth a couple points. And so in the grand scheme of things, who cares? And so I think a critical thing with those frequent low stakes assignments is really explicitly linking doing those assignments to the final grade. So when I used to go through my class syllabus on the first day of class, I would say, if you don't do these weekly assignments, the highest grade you can get in this class will be a B. And if you get a C, you'll end up getting a D. If you get a D, you'll end up failing. And I say, you know, every year students fail simply because they didn't do the weekly assignments. And then also giving students constant feedback on their standing and how it's contributing to their grade. So your average grade today would be an F because you haven't done any of these frequent assignments, and doing what used to be called intrusive advising, and I think there's a nicer word for it now, but where you actually reach out to students who aren't doing those assignments in a super friendly way and say, you know, I noticed that you're not turning in these assignments and I'm concerned because it, you know, it really does snowball. Could you stop by and talk to me? And oftentimes, if you make that personal connection, the students feel like they're in trouble, but when they come to talk to you, you are nothing but nice and warm. And, you know, what's the challenge? How do we get you doing this? But definitely, we can't assume that all students understand the sort of broad structure of success in a college class. And I think one big difference is understanding how all those little things add up. Anything else before we move on? Okay, so just a quick summary of the research. As Harriet mentioned, she has just published this paper in Research and Practice and Assessment, which is summarizing our findings. We did disaggregated data analysis in 9 classes with high DFW rates from UNC Charlotte. And basically what the paper shows is that the pattern of equity gaps is not the same for final grades than it is for assignments, which we think is a critical piece of this puzzle, right? If students are showing equity gaps on some assignments, but not all assignments, we have to really dig in and look at those assignments where there are gaps and see what we can do. In that paper and the other paper we mentioned, we've analyzed data from a number of different classes in different institutions. using both grade disaggregation at the assignment level, but also surveying students, faculty, and assessment professionals about how they view assignments typically using those two measures that we showed you before. And so we've come up with sort of what we're talking about is high risk and low risk assignments. And before I show you the list, you probably could guess it. But high risk assignments don't mean you can't use those assignments. They mean that they're more often assignments where we see equity gaps, and they're more often assignments where students, faculty, and staff say there is limited inclusive content or utility value. So when you're using those assignments, really intentionally thinking of ways to boost utility value and inclusive content are critical. The other assignments tend to be naturally high in inclusive content and utility value, especially utility value. Inclusive content varies more across assignment type, and we tend to see less equity gaps in those assignments. So the sort of riskier assignments generally are tests. In general, multiple choice tests are more problematic than open book or open-ended, than open answer, like free response tests. We see problems in tests, whether they're low stakes or high stakes. Interestingly, whether they're open book or online. So even online tests seems to be problematic. But not all tests. So if you go to that paper, you'll see there's many classes using multiple choice tests that are just fine. So it's not that tests are impossible to do in an equitable way, it's that we need to be more careful and thoughtful about it. Homework, and this goes to Angela's comment, people put weekly homework assignments in as a way to try and boost equity and scaffold performance in their classes. But without careful thought, what can happen is students can end up, there can be equity gaps that are driven just by lack of completion of homework or by inattentive completion. So you need to be thoughtful about how you put homework in. And then writing generally tends to be better in terms of equity, inclusive content, and utility value. But those formal essays, the 5-paragraph essay that I failed on terribly in middle school, of the types of writing, those tend to be the ones that are more likely to show equity gaps. Less risky. So writing in general, writing in the discipline, when you make it really clear what the professional value of that writing is and when it's a major for which that writing is valued. So for example, I was a psychology faculty member. In psychology, the faculty really want everyone to be researchers, and we want to train people in writing research papers. The students maybe don't care as much about that. They're more interested in being clinicians. So case report writing will be more interesting to students than lab report writing from that perspective. But to whatever extent you can convince students that the writing is going to have value to them, that helps. And also writing in the discipline tends to have really clear, explicit rules. Like in psychology, the APA manual tells you everything you need to do. And so that probably also helps writing in the discipline be a little more inclusive. Reflective writing, we've already talked about. Inclusive projects, which we're using to describe projects where students perhaps get to either select the genre they're going to write in, if it's a writing project, or select the material they're going to write about, if it's a science or math project, so that they can find content that is meaningful to them. Group projects, especially when we talk about the value of the group effort to future work. E-portfolios, which I will not go on ad nauseum about, but that was like my first love, and I'm happy to talk about it if people are interested. And work for flipped classes. Really interestingly, the one place where we saw a reverse equity gap, I believe, was in an accounting flipped class at UNCC. And there on the preparation work, transfer students and underrepresented ethnic minority students actually got higher grades. And if you think about it, when you're doing homework and then you're going to have to show up and show what you know in a group setting, that may really boost the utility value. So that's sort of the overall model. We have references and links to both of the papers at the end of the slides, and we will share those with you. And I want to use our remaining 40 minutes to go through how we think you can apply this. So I'm not going to stop for questions unless somebody has something really pressing. So I'm going to turn it back to Harriet, who's going to talk about the first thing you need to do, which is trying to identify the focus for your improvement or the students.
Thank you, Karen. And so as you think about ways to reduce equity gaps in your course, focus on or think about who in your class lack privilege. For example, is it underrepresented ethnic minority students, first-generation college students, transfer students? And so in our paper, we discuss URIM students, which is underrepresented minority students and transfer students, and the courses that we found had equity gaps. And then also student with different disabilities or different abilities. And then students with limited financial resources. And a lot of this information, as you begin to focus for improvement, can be found in our learning management system or the student data management system where this information is housed. And then also consider which assignments might benefit. And so as you think about it, you can reflect on previous student performance. So how has previous students done on these assignments? And then talk to the students. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, talk to the students beyond learning their name. Ask, you can quickly do a poll everywhere, do an index card, and I like to refer to as a muddiest point. It's an assessment tool or assessment strategy where you ask students after an assignment and you realize students didn't really do well in the assignment, during the next class, you can say, okay, write on on an index paper, what was the muddiest point? What did you not understand? And so that can give you some feedback from the students. And then also survey your students. Karen, my colleague, has developed a survey to measure these constructs. And so you can actually survey students and then they can offer feedback on the type of the assignments that are in the class. Okay, and I think that is it. Karen, did you want to add or do we have time?
You know, the one thing maybe is
Okay.
just in all the work we've done. And so, you know, I encourage you to look at the paper about the UNCC data, but it's really interesting because sometimes people think, well, are you, you know, dumbing it down, or is this, you know, catering to certain groups of students? And what we've found is when you improve, well, when there's equity gaps in an assignment, generally they're for many of these groups. So it's not like, you know, it's just one group of students, but it can be different depending on the class. But also when you make these improvements, all you're doing is increasing the transparency or the connection between learning and measurement. So you're getting rid of noise, you're not getting rid of measurement of ability. And that's what we're driving for here. And so keep that in mind as we move through. We are never asking you to simplify or reduce your expectations for students. What we are hoping you will do over the next year is increase the extent to which your measurements are clear and specific enough to truly measure that learning that you're interested in. So now we're moving into the applied part. And I'm going to go through utility value and inclusive content, thinking about chronologically the different parts of your class. So on the first day, I think that is one of the critical moments, and you could even take this back to your course description if you wanted to go back and look at that in your course catalog, but really thinking about selling the utility value of your class on the very first day, I think is an important thing. And any of you who've written grants or things like that might know about logic models. I have a distorted type of logic model I'm going to present to you and ask you to think about. But actually, even before I do that, on the first day, I view it as my responsibility to explain to my students why my class is worth their while. And I find that it's helpful for my students in terms of making it very explicit, the utility value, and it's helpful for me in terms of keeping my focus on what is valuable in the class. A lot of students during COVID-19 said they felt like faculty were making assignments just to fill their time with no point. And I don't actually think that was probably true. I think occasionally it was true, but I think what was true was that faculty were not adequately communicating to students what the benefit of the different activities they were asking of those students was. And I think the first day of class and your syllabus is a key place to do this. So what you can see here is sort of this rough, distorted logic model from one of the classes I used to teach. It was a class called Practicum in Child Development. And what I like to start out with, and this is what I talk about, I actually talk about this whole thing on the first day, is what are the skills that I want students to get from the class? So what are the skills I'm trying to teach? And I try and think about those in terms of academic, professional, and personal, fitting those 3 types of utility value. So from an academic perspective, students in that class were required to do weekly writing assignments. So there's research that just shows getting students to write a lot helps their writing abilities. I didn't care about grammar or sentence structure or anything like that in those assignments, but the writing itself I felt was useful for them. They were required to observe kids every week using specific observational checklists, and that was the material where they had to, in their reports, separate out their observations from their interpretations. And that was a critical skill they needed to learn that would be relevant in terms of psychology, observational research, but also experimental research moving forward. That idea that you make an observation that is behaviorally based and then separately make an interpretation of that. And so that was this observation and reasoning and knowing the difference between the two. What did you directly observe and what did you infer from it? And what was the research that backed up that inference? Because they had readings that told them how to make those interpretations. Professionally, that writing was writing progress reports for preschool age children, which is a skill that would help in terms of a long-term outcome if they wanted to get a job in childcare or teaching. And they also were learning teaching because they had to make lesson plans and things like that. And then personally, they were learning things that would have relevance to their parenting because they were learning best practices for interactions with preschool age children. And I made the argument to them they were learning things that would have relevance to their personal relationships, because in marital therapy, one of the big things they teach you to do, and all psychology majors cared a lot about therapy, is not to confuse your observations and your interpretations, right? So you would say, when you do this, right? When you don't take out the garbage, it makes me feel that you don't value me. And so I would explicitly say the same skill I'm teaching you in preschool observations and report writing is going to help you in your relationships. And I would talk about all that on the first day. I would talk about how the assignments, those observational reports, I don't have the lesson plans here, but the lesson plans and the reflective writing would help them develop each of those skills. And I would go to the outcomes that by the time you finish this class, you can put on your resume that you're better prepared for childcare positions, and you can know going into your classes that these skills are going to help you in later psychology classes where you have to separate out observations and make logical arguments. So that's the logic model. That's sort of how you go through it on the first day. What I'd like you to do now is, Harriet, if you don't mind putting the link to the Google Doc.
Yes, it's there. It's in the chat.
If you go to that Google Doc, I'm going to only give 5 minutes for this, but I want you to just, for the assignment or for the class you're thinking about modifying, do a quick set of notes for yourself about what you think the academic, professional, and personal skills that students could be developing. And sometimes personal is hard, but think really hard if you can think of any. So like statistics, being able to actually read research and make sense of it can be critical for personal decisions, like do you want to do a healthcare choice, for example.
And as you open the link for the chat, within the chat to the Google Doc, you can scroll through the Google Doc and find your name and you can key your information there.
Right. And so this is, oh, sorry, I have it here too, but we're just asking you to do the skills section of it right now. So it seems like many of you have made it through the 3. And so in the name of time, I'm going to keep moving. And, you know, this document will be accessible to everybody moving forward. So now when we think about our assignments, and you'll notice that the next 2 parts of the document are thinking about ways you can increase utility value or inclusive content in your assignment. So feel free to put notes in as that's relevant. Within your assignments, as well as on your first day, once you've fully brainstormed all of the academic, personal, and professional utility value for your assignments, make it really explicit. So in class, it's a really good idea to talk about assignments and don't assume students know the assignments from the syllabus. And when you talk about the assignments, rather than simply saying they're due, talking about ways that students in the past have lost points on assignments will boost inclusive content. But talking about the important skills the assignment is going to give them will both make it more inclusive because the students are going to see what you're looking for, but it also will boost the utility value. When you're giving feedback on assignments, try to provide feedback that notices improved skills and their value and doesn't just notice absolute performance. So if you want to build academic self-efficacy in students, if a student is getting an F on assignments and they move up to a D, that's a huge improvement, right? Imagine going from a 30 to a 60. If you went from a 60 to a 90, we would all say, wow. But we need to be sure that for each student, we're actually honing into that student and acknowledging when they've improved, even if they aren't still succeeding. And saying that explicitly in your feedback isn't that hard to do, even in a large class, because you can copy and paste a comment 1,000,000 times, or, you know, through Turnitin, you can have automatic assignment comments that get pasted in. But noticing where they've improved will encourage them to continue to improve. And it also, you know, when we were thinking about those worst assignments where we felt shame, if you say to a student, you know, you're not there yet, but I see you've come enormous ways in terms of this, focus on this new thing for the next one. I'm really terrible at learning languages, and I desperately wanted to learn Hebrew, and I went all the way through advanced Hebrew in college. And in my final Hebrew class, it was by this renowned scholar of Amos Oz, a famous Israeli author, and we were having to write essays about Amos Oz's writing. And I did terribly on the essays because I was really bad at language. But once the professor said to me, you know, Karen, I can see your ideas are better than your language skills. And I still remember that comment. And it was so affirming to me because I was trying my very hardest, and that he could actually recognize that I was thinking well, even if I still wasn't writing well, was incredibly meaningful. And so, you know, when you think about those moments in your own life where somebody took the time to see an ability, even when it was surrounded by a lack of ability, those are really important moments in students' lives. I also had talked earlier about the value of this thing that's referred to as social pedagogy. This idea was come up with by Randy Bass, and it's where you encourage intense communication around an authentic task. And so ePortfolios is a common place where we think about social pedagogy, because students oftentimes when they create an e-portfolio are doing it for an imagined audience, oftentimes of future employers or faculty or friends. But any one of these types of tasks here, parent share, e-portfolios, blogs, or teaching videos, anytime you're asking students, even group work, to engage with their peers in an intense way, communicatively, you increase the value of it. Students care a lot about how they're seen by their peers, especially today with social media being such a primary means of communication for youth. When you include images in assignments, you will dramatically bring up the utility value for students if they're sharing it with a peer group. And so ePortfolios do that really naturally, but there's other ways you can do that as well. And then reflective assignments, students developmentally, most of them are in the adolescent stage of development when they're really fascinated by themselves more than just about anything else. And so anytime you ask students to use your material to understand themselves better, or to think about themselves or think about something that's meaningful to them, that has very strong value. But also when you ask them to reflect on their learning, that helps students develop academic self-efficacy. So when you ask students reflective questions like, what don't you understand? What previous learning are you using here? What was the most helpful study technique you did? They find that very interesting, and it also is going to help them become better students by thinking about their own learning. So how do we create reflective assignments in things that aren't psychology is the number one question that I get. So the first is this: you can create categories of questions like I just described, where you ask students to evaluate themselves, the value of their learning. So which information did you find most affirming or most helpful, right? So Harriet talked about the muddiest point. This is essentially the clearest point, right? When you went through today's lecture, what helped you most? And then after students write on that for a moment, you can say, okay, if you know that's the sort of thing that helps you, then when you're studying, do this, that, or the other, right? And you can even do this as a poll everywhere question if you don't want them to actually have to write. So reflection doesn't have to be really time consuming. Which type of studying helps you most, or when I was going over this concept, which type of example was most useful to you? Which pieces of your work would benefit from more study? So that can be in one of those test wrap questions right at the end of an exam. Students will be feeling frustrated, but before they leave the room and say vile things about you or your class, if you ask them to own a little bit their experience in the test by writing about what they think they need to study most, you're increasing the chances that they're actually going to study that for the next test. And especially if you shoot out an email right before the next test that tells them what they said they needed to study more. So you personalize it in that way. How is this an example of this learning outcome? So we all have learning outcomes for our classes, and we know how everything is connected, but oftentimes students don't. The Socratic method can be a really good way to actually get students to make that connection. So, if you never ask them what learning outcome is something an example of, they may never think of it. But if you ask them, you say, these are the 6 major learning outcomes, which one does this relate to? That reflection is going to build better knowledge in them. And it's going to also help them realize the value of what they're learning, right? It boosts utility value because they're linking it up to this important concept in the class. You can have reflective questions that encourage students to make connections with their lived experiences. So that is the Herakowitz example that I talked to you about with the biology class. That was sort of reflective questions they were doing, but this can be done in essays, in short answer questions on tests, in 1-minute writes in class. What would you want to tell a friend about this work? And, oftentimes that can be challenging. It's going to take students time they may say, I don't know, nothing, right? But if you really encourage them to dig deep, assign a few points for it, getting them to pick something, it will make them value it. Because once they've said that, then they're like, okay, this is something I think is valuable. You use these concepts to explain something you've seen in the world. And I love this last one. What values are shared between your family and this discipline? There's really interesting work that's shown that if you get students to just write about their values, it's called a values affirmation exercise, it reduces equity gaps. This is mostly in high school and middle school students. But oftentimes in our professional fields, at some point, we're teaching them about the ethics of our discipline. And oftentimes, especially within STEM, I think students can feel that science is something other than their culture of origin. And so asking them to really reflect on scientific values and think about where there's overlap with their personal values is a great way to get them to realize that their own community is not distinct from this scientific community. And then planning questions are the last type of reflective questions. Describe a way that you'll change your future work or plans based on what you learned in this class. And that can be content oriented, right? Like based on what you got wrong on this test, what will you do differently on the next test? Or it can be based on this thing you learned about biology or public health or statistics. How would you approach polling or, anything like that? And what do you want to be sure to remember? I ended all of my classes asking students 3 most important things they thought they learned in the class, which was really useful to me in terms of seeing whether the focus of my class was what I intended it to be. And I think it was useful to the students because at least those 3 things they're more likely to remember if they said, these are the most important things. On the last day, return to your logic model and have a little focus group. If you're still trying to get tenure, I don't think any of you guys are, but it's a great way to diffuse situations prior to teaching evaluations. When you say, I'm really interested in improving this class, you know, this is how I structured the class. Remember, I told you this on the first day. These were my goals for all these assignments. How can I make it better? And getting that feedback is incredibly useful to you. I've gotten some of my best ideas for revising a class from things students have suggested when you're in that focus group kind of way, you know, and I'll go skill by skill. Like, did this help you with your writing? How would it have helped you more with your writing? Did this help you with your observational skills? How would it help you more, etc. Then remind them of the outcomes from your logic model and things that they should write on their resume or things they should save for future classes, right? So if your class is a prerequisite class for another class, sort of ending up with, these are the key things you're going to need to know next semester, and I would save all the assignments that relate to this, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's this encourage saving, sharing, and practicing. One thing that I've done, which is really nice when you have students doing a lot of separate little writing assignments that you know are all related in some larger scheme, is just telling them, you know, you will love to have this writing 20 years from now. You'll look back on this and find this fascinating, or all this writing you did about this will be really useful in your next level of classes when you need to know X, Y, or Z. And then you can really easily now just curate it. So what you can see there on the bottom right is I just made it into 2 columns so it looks like a book, and I put a box around it. Once I put little kids playing around a child development one, and you email the PDF back to them or the document back to them. And the other thing that they're super impressed by is, you know, if you have weekly or daily writing assignments, they can have written 40 pages in a semester. And when you say, you know, for your capstone class, you're going to have to write a 20-page paper, which may seem scary and intimidating, but for this class, you wrote a 40-page paper, and here it is. And just remember that, you know, writing is something that if you do it every day, just piles up. And this is how you should approach these future tasks. And then, yeah, so curating student work, highlighting useful things from your class, and providing tips for practice moving forward. So in a statistics class, you know, saying when you read the newspaper, think about how you would analyze, anytime you read a science article, think about how you would analyze that data if you were interested. If you read polling results, think about what sample was used, you know, so the more you make connections between what they've done in your class and things they can do to keep that skill active, the better, and the higher the utility value. Increasing inclusive content, and I know I'm going a little fast because I want us to have a little time at the end to discuss. So Harriet already mentioned this. It is so important to consider both cost and content when you're selecting your materials. So, you know, when I started off teaching psychology, I would try and have students read full research articles pretty early on. And that was fine for students that were like my top 5%. But, you know, my bottom 95% were overwhelmed and lost by those articles. And so I quickly discovered that using sort of lower level journal articles that were more like brief summary articles was a much better way to introduce students to experimental research literature. Within textbooks, I started off using the definitive child development textbook that was like 1,000 pages long and written in college level English. And I really quickly learned that finding a much more basic textbook that focused on the key concepts and using my lectures and discussions as ways to get across some of those finer points was a much better way to do it. And then the cost of textbooks, there's research that shows that when you use expensive textbooks, even when you have reserve copies available through the library, students who are financially challenged either won't buy the textbook, will get a free PDF of the textbook, or won't buy the textbook until after their first financial aid check comes through, at which point they may be 2 weeks behind in the class. So we have to think very hard. If we're using a paid textbook simply because of the test bank, that's probably not a good enough reason, and we really need to seek out open educational resources, online articles, other things. When we're using software, we have to think in terms of both the inclusive content, but also the utility value. Many software companies will give inexpensive student accounts, but then students no longer can use that when they aren't a student. So for example, within statistics, it's easier to teach SPSS than it is to teach R. But if you teach a student to use R, which is free open software, you can tell them you can use this in a summer job, you can use this for anything. It's a tool that they'll have for life, and that's going to make it higher in utility value. And it's also going to reduce the cost because there's no charge for it. Providing clear routes to supports. So Harriet mentioned this as well, but students with privilege will grab the supports that they need because they feel entitled to them. Students who lack privilege for any one of a large multitude of reasons will not, right? So the student who feels like an imposter for whatever reason, because of disability, because of racial or ethnic group, because of transfer status, because of income, any of those reasons, they're not going to raise their hand and ask when your instructions are unclear. They're going to sit there and think, I'm the only one who doesn't know, and if I ask, I'm outing myself. And they're not going to try and find out if they have the abilities in a public way, right? So if you say, does anybody not understand this concept, and make students raise their hand, if the students who don't understand, if there's one with privilege that's willing to raise their hand because they don't think anyone's going to judge them, you're in luck. But if it's only students who, for whatever reason, don't feel that strong sense of belonging in the classroom, then they won't raise their hand and they won't find out. So making clear routes to support available to all students is critical. Providing private self-assessments that aren't graded and that don't go to the professor, so that a student can do an online assessment and then ideally be linked to just-in-time information that will provide them the support they need, or just write with your instructions, say, these are the 4 skills you need to do this assignment. If you're not sure, here's links to an online resource or a little mini article that you can quickly read to get that skill. And then it's not enough to hold office hours. We have to be welcoming in our office hours. So students all know that some faculty hold office hours and growl at you when you get there, and other faculty like invite you to the office hours, and you want to be the faculty member who invites the students to the office hours. When I used to teach large lecture classes, anybody who got a D or F on the first exam, I would handwrite on their Scantron before I returned it to them, please drop by and see me soon. And they sometimes felt like they were in trouble, but I would have a line out my office for the next 3 office hours. They would come into my office. It would be like a 30-second, I saw the first testing go well for you. Have you taken multiple choice tests before? I really want to help you with this, establishing myself as an ally and as somebody that was available to help them. And then those students would keep coming back to the office hours and get the support that they needed. And then establishing a supportive environment within the classroom. If you possibly can, not grading on a curve, grading on criterion, making those criteria really clear, making it very explicit that it's your goal for every student to pass this class and get the highest grade they can possibly grade. And I'd be explicit in saying not by dumbing it down or by making exceptions, right? So I'm very strong of the opinion that I don't make exceptions to things that are posted in my syllabus as my rules. And I say that up front because I view that as unfair. Because generally what happens is the students with more privilege are the ones who ask for exceptions. And if you want to be fair, you don't want to make exceptions. You want to be fair for everybody. But if you say, this is what you have to do, if you do what you have to do, you can get an A in this class, and this is what you have to do. To truly value questions. So there is no dumb question, and there's sometimes annoying questions, but that's why we are paid. And so setting up an environment where you truly welcome questions and acknowledge the fact that if one student is asking the question, 9 times out of 10, there's at least 8 other students who aren't understanding it. Occasionally you get students who can't stop asking questions. And even in that case, saying to the student privately, not in public, because that would be shaming, that there's not enough time in lecture to handle all their questions and you very much appreciate their questions, but going forward, they can ask 1 question per class, and then you'd like them to write all the questions down so that you can answer them concisely in the next class or by email. And helping students form relationships. So the more you can create a sense of community in your class, I would have students on the first day of class turn to their right and their left and exchange phone numbers with each other, and then use that as an informal network. And again, that's inclusive because some students are going to have relationships going in, but the new transfer student won't. And if you make it part of your class setup. And Monica, I see your hand is up, but I'm just trying to get through all the content, and then I'm going to leave time for discussion once we get there. If you are having students do writing or any complicated project, considering using rubrics that have very detailed breakdown of every element you're expecting in the assignment, going over them in class, highlighting areas where previous students have lost points, and then being sure that your grading is really focusing only on those. I think one of the things I like best about rubrics is it makes it less likely that implicit biases will influence our grading without us intending to. So you can be influenced, for example, by a student's style of writing, when that's not something that you're actually trying to teach. But if you don't give points for, writing clarity or writing grammar, then you're less likely to take off points for that. Your instructions should be clear and explicit and aligned with the rubrics. So always I have to go back and forth between my assignment instructions and my rubric, because every time I create one, I'll have more in my rubric than I have in my instructions. So then you go back and put it in your instructions, you put the rubric into your instructions, and you encourage students to self-grade before they turn it in by going through the rubric themselves. Limit reliance on material you haven't taught in every place that you can. So even, and I always get this question, but even if a class is a prerequisite, assuming, and at UNC Charlotte this is the case, you have a large number of transfer students, you can't assume that everybody's had the same exposure to that content. Coming off of COVID-19, we must assume that content was lost over the last year. And with all the online content we now have accessible, to whatever extent you can build in links to that content, the better. And I know I've said that before. One of my favorite techniques for this, most of us on this group are white, and most of our students, or a good chunk of our students, aren't white. And so when we're trying to create video content, that's a great place that we can support diversity of leadership by asking students of color or of other groups, disability, any visible minority, to create video tutorials around topics where they've mastered it. Can be a great way to increase the extent to which students are seeing people in positions of power that reflect the diversity of the room. And creating those video tutorials is a social pedagogy exercise. So you can even make this an assignment where you have everybody in your class create a video tutorial on a concept that people find challenging. And then you can honor some of the top ones by asking if they can be used as future class content. Provide feedback that is growth oriented and notes improvement, right? Whether or not a student gets an A, B, C, D, or even F, you want to attend to improvement, and you want to focus on what the student should do next to improve more, right? So you're not going to get an F student to an A student overnight. When you're giving feedback to an F student, you want to think, what does it take to get this F student to a D in the next assignment? And that's where your feedback should be focused. And then create an inclusive assessment environment. I've already talked about encouraging questions. Encourage questions during tests, and use them to improve current and future assignments. Every time a student asks you a question, make a note of it, go back to your assignment and think, is this question answered in my instructions? And sometimes it will be, and the student didn't read the instructions or missed it, but sometimes it won't be. And so student questions are an opportunity for improvement. Every time a student asks you a question, and this is really critical, share the answer with the whole class. So oftentimes those eager beaver students show up in our office hours and ask all kinds of questions that we didn't put in our assignment and that are super helpful, and make note of them. And when you get into class, the next class, or if it's the assignment is due the next day, shoot out an email to your class saying, I had a student come by with these questions. These answers might be helpful to everybody. Create a welcoming environment. Smile. I know females are told to smile more than men. We should all smile. We should all fake it till we make it, right? I know there were days I walked into class and I did not want to be there, but you should always act like it's your favorite place to be and your students are your favorite people. And if you hate a student, and you will, you have to find something you don't hate about that student and focus on it, because students pick up on it. And that welcoming environment, again, won't be so important to students. It's not going to hurt anybody having a welcoming environment, but you do hurt the students who lack privilege when you don't have a welcoming environment. And you also want to reduce the factors that highlight privilege. So one of them is, whenever possible, use blind grading, because implicit bias affects most of us, whether we want to believe it or not, and not just in terms of race and ethnicity, also in terms of the student you hate, right? You may grade soft on that student because you hate them. You may grade hard on that student, but we're better, fairer graders when we don't know who we're grading. We've talked about the importance of trying to diversify your teaching faculty and support staff. When you are looking for teaching assistants, that's a great place to seek out students that reflect the diversity of your class. And when you're using undergraduate assistants, that's an even better place to do that. And then this is really critical. When we talk about having diversity in the examples that we use that represents the diversity of the class, you don't just want to set up people from different racial, ethnic, ability groups as superstars. You want to set all of us up as failable people. And so when we share biographies or share our own biography, highlighting our own struggles is a really good way to make the environment seem inclusive. I was a terrible procrastinator in my youth, and I would share that with students and talk to them about how I overcame it and how much harm it caused me at points in my life. And when you do that, you lower yourself from being the sage on the stage and make yourself a little bit more accessible, and it makes students more able to feel comfortable acknowledging their own struggles. And then what about tests? And I know I'm at time. I'm going to just put these up here, and then I'm going to open it up for discussion. Test blueprints will let you go down to the level of test questions. Having students ask questions and provide feedback during the test and after the test, limiting testing anxiety. And then this final one, increasing utility value. Explain why memorization, fast response, skills, and multiple choice testing is necessary for academic or professional success. I see a typo there. So, some of us are going to use multiple choice tests because students are going to have to pass those exams in their fields, and we know that, but make sure that they know that. And then explicitly instruct students on how to take and succeed on multiple choice tests if that's part of the problem. Okay, so your homework is going to be going to the Google Doc and writing down the things you want to remember from all this. And the other piece of homework is, by May 27th, sending Harriet descriptions of the assignment categories in the classes that you wish, the class that you're going to try and modify. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have multiple choice exams, reaction papers, and a formal essay, and that's what your grading is based on. You're going to say, I have 3 basic types of assignments that aren't just like attendance, right? We don't care about that. The first are multiple choice exams. These are open book, open note, online multiple choice exams worth 30% of the grade. The second is reaction papers. There's 10 of them, and I use a rubric to grade them, and they're asking students to relate the content to their lives, right? So you get the idea. Just give us descriptions of what they are, the percentage of grade determined by each group, and then from the most recent time you taught the class, or if you want, you can even do it from a couple times you taught the class, if you didn't change the class. We need an Excel file that has each student on a line, and then for each column, their average grade across an assignment category. So if you have 5 multiple choice tests, what's their average grade across the 5 tests? And you can decide if you want to include missing grades or not. So if they miss a test, I would encourage you to include them, especially for things like homework, because not completing assignments can actually lead to some equity gaps. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to get from the campus records, their race and ethnicity, their sex, their transfer status. And maybe if we can get something about income, and we're going to disaggregate the grades and give them back to you, which will give you a sense of which of your assignments might be polling equity gaps. Any questions about that? And then just to think about, as you're thinking about your learning intervention, as I said, I'll send you these slides. If you want us to quiz your students on their feelings about the assignments you're putting in the class, we can administer that survey with those questions for you and any other questions that you would want. And if you want us to do that, this doesn't have to even happen until August. You would just send me descriptions of the assignment categories. So on that, I know I rushed. I'm happy to stay on as long as anybody wants to talk. And I'm sorry that we kind of ran out of time for this, but I feel like the discussion we were having earlier was really good. So questions, comments, or thoughts?
So in terms of, is one class enough for this? I generally only teach one class a semester. So would you want me to have multiple semesters for the group percentages? How many students are you looking for?
Well, so if you wanted it to be statistically significant, more students are more likely to be statistically significant. If you've been teaching your class the same way for 5 years, I would say it's better data. If you feel like it's changed every year, it's probably better just to do the most recent. Really, this is, eventually any of you who want to do published research on this, we're definitely looking to go in that direction. And when you try and publish research, it becomes important to get statistical significance. But in terms of you thinking about where you want to make changes, the idea is just for you to get as full a picture as we can give you of what's the landscape of how these different factors are influencing performance on different assignments. If you're doing more than 1 year, then give us a column with the year, because we'll need that to be able to pull the data potentially, I think. Actually, we might not, but just give it to us just in case. Any other questions? I'm sorry that we were so rushed on the application section.
Karen, I have 1 or 2 questions. So there was one course, for example, global health that I teach. I used to have a very different set of variety of assignments, and based on the student feedback, I brought it down to mostly multiple choice and just one written assignment. And now I'm getting a feedback that is completely inconsistent with the previous one. So that is one course I wanted to use for this, this project that I'm working with you guys. But also there is another course that I taught last fall, and I'm going to be teaching again this fall. I was wondering if I could share data from all of both these courses and we could compare.
Absolutely.
And also, am I understanding?
And you're bringing up a really good point. If you've done some modifications that you sort of thought were supposed to help across different years, and you want us to look across a few different years, just specify if you want us, so if you give me multiple years as a column, just say whether those years should be analyzed together or analyzed separately. So for you, Monica, probably you'd say, compare this year to those years, so that you could see whether when you had more writing assignments, was it actually more equitable or less equitable?
Okay, and my second question is my understanding right that I would be importing this data from the gradebook in Canvas?
However you want. So if you keep a separate Excel file that you then use to fill in Canvas, whichever, we need an Excel file with student ID numbers so that we can get the demographic information, but however is easiest for you to get it is fine with us.
I think Gradebook will be the easiest because I do download the data from Gradebook in Excel, and I can put different tabs with different years and details and send it as one Excel file for you guys.
Perfect.
And would it be okay if I sent it for the other course that I have just taught once and I'll be teaching again this fall, and I want to see what can be done because I think have some time to do some interventions in the fall because I haven't finalized the syllabus yet.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, Karen.
And are there any questions about any of do you feel like you have enough ideas about places to increase utility value or inclusive content or some other improvement? And the other thing is, I think looking at that shared, we created the Google document so you can look at what other people are thinking, and anything you put in there is shared with everybody. So it can be a good resource for sharing your thoughts as they evolve.
I don't know if it's helpful to the entire group, or I can have a consultation with you, Karen. The last part of your presentation, I was making notes and I'm like, yes, 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 giving detailed rubrics, in the syllabus for some of the courses, I even put that, if you're doing this assignment, what does it measure? How will it help you? I am still a little bit confused if that is really getting translated or students don't read it, or I put in a lot of effort in my courses, and that's the reason I joined this project, was to see how I can, like I give detailed rubrics, my instructions are detailed to the core, and still students, for example, this semester I had when there is a writing assignment, I kind of mandated that at least one peer reviewed reference, not your textbook and things. And people, I think I also include that so they get used to not plagiarizing. I have an EndNote workshop in my class. I bring a librarian to teach them things. And I still feel those things are missing. So I would want to know where else and how else could I emphasize these things?
Yeah, well, two thoughts. One is students oftentimes don't read written things. And, we can say that that's wrong and they should, and it's their responsibility, but the truth is they don't. And oftentimes students who were less well prepared in high school or have more family pressures or a million things are less likely to. So I'm a strong advocate for discussing things in class that are required in assignments. And even students who read, that discussion is going to reach them better. The other thing is, and I think maybe I underemphasized this a little more than I should, grades matter. And so when you're thinking about what you grade, attaching points to everything you want students to do is worthwhile, and making very transparent how those grades add up. The first day of class, like I said, saying, if you don't do all these little things, you're going to be knocked down a full grade. It could be the difference between you passing and failing. Also, not letting students make things up at the end. So, when you have like weekly assignments and you let students do it at the end, they're not benefiting from doing them weekly then, which we know that getting students to spend time every week on a class closes equity gaps and increases student academic self-efficacy. So you need to structure your class so that the points reward doing things every week, and then you need to be really explicit about how that's happening and give students explicit, frequent feedback about their standing in the class. Because students who lack academic self-efficacy, who are oftentimes students that are underserved in one way or another, will be fuzzy about their grade. And it's a little bit of a protective thing. You'll ask a student who's failing how they're doing, and 9 times out of 10, they'll say, oh, I don't know. We haven't really gotten any grades back yet. And that may be because they haven't done any assignments. So setting up your grade book so that it notifies students every 2 or 3 weeks, this is the points you've gotten, of the points possible, this is your current standing in the class, and then explicitly telling students what they need to do to correct that. The other thing is, even though I said, don't let students make up weekly assignments at the end, creating a fail-safe for students that are going to mess up the first time, and explaining your thinking about that in terms of your grading structure is also really useful. So if you say there's 4 section exams in this class, you can drop your lowest grade, and that can be either from a missed exam or from your lowest grade. I strongly encourage everybody to take the first exam, because oftentimes students will do really poorly on the first exam because they're learning about the level of detail they need to know in this class. And so that's why I have it structured so that you can drop that, but if you don't take it, you won't benefit from that. And then really reminding them of that. Part of helping students is being a little parental in the classroom.
I have a question, Karen. Some of my assignments, well, every student needs to submit their own homework assignments, and they complete homework assignments through Canvas. So they each need to submit their own. However, I encourage group work, and some students work by themselves, and then some students form study groups. So I'm just trying to, while I understand, this data is some kind of reflection of equity and how we could get some kind of information from that, What I don't have is obviously students that participated in groups versus those that don't.
Right.
I'm sure that you've dealt with situations like this before. What's one of the ways that you would still use the information gained from getting these student records?
Well, I think if you feel that the group work is allowing them to learn and allowing you to evaluate them, and that's the structure of your class, then what we may find is there aren't equity gaps in those assignments that allow group work, but there are equity gaps in some of the assignments that are fed by that, right? So if they're supposed to be getting practice that is then measured in the tests, and you find there aren't equity gaps where students' grades may be supported by the work of their peers, but there are in the exams, then that might lead you to conclude that you need to think about some more individual assessments. There's a neat structure I read about people used in biochemistry, I think it was, where you had to do a pre-test when you got to class. And if you got above a minimum score on the pre-test, then you could work with a group to answer all the questions and get the benefit of the group score. But you had to get a minimum score. So it guaranteed that students did some work coming in because they wanted to be good enough to benefit from the group work. So, if you found that the tests were showing equity gaps, but those assignments that you let be either way weren't, you might consider shifting to a structure like that. Does that address your concerns? And, I think Harriet and I are happy to have another group meeting. If anybody wants to have a chance to talk about this more, we're certainly happy to, I'm happy to stay on. I don't know if Harriet has something else. I don't have anything till 1 today, so I'm not in a hurry to leave. And we want to support you as much as we can in any way we can.
Yeah, another question. While we all work really, really hard to make sure that our students can't cheat on exams, especially in an online environment from COVID, there's just certain things that, perhaps we weren't good at, or, we've learned more from one semester to the next. Cheating or, unauthorized group collaborations, what kind of stuff, you all have been doing research on this for quite some time. How have you dealt with that kind of stuff, just from an equity perspective?
Yeah, we haven't done research on cheating per se, but I think and Harriet can add in, I think there's pretty good research that suggests that the more strict your monitoring of student cheating is, the more likely you are to evoke things like stereotype threat. And so our office in general has been advising that creating tests that are conceptual in nature. So, like within statistics, getting students to supply their own material that they have to analyze, for example, so that they can't cheat. So creating cheating-proof testing environments, and then, lockdown browsers are really shown to be inequitable, just even based on broadband access and stuff like that. And the fact that if a student is nervous and their eyes are flitting, that can, and the harm of accusing a student of cheating when they aren't is so much greater than the harm of missing a student who's cheating. So all those things, I'm personally in favor of, whenever possible, using open book, open note tests, where you are really asking those challenging questions at the higher level of Bloom's taxonomy, getting students to relate things to their own experience, to other classes, all those sorts of things. The other thing is, the more you explain the utility value for future academic work, professional success of the stuff you're teaching, the less likely people are to cheat. Because if you say really clearly, if you cheat on this class, you are going to fail when you take the MCAT, right? Because the MCAT, you're not going to cheat on the MCAT, and the MCAT's going to have a whole section on statistics, and you need to know this stuff. Or, if you don't understand statistics, you're not going to be able to make good healthcare decisions, because, increasingly people have to be their own doctor, and you have to be able to read a research report and understand what the meaning of something being statistically significant, or the danger of a type 1 versus type 2 error, whatever. So, Harriet, did I sort of capture us there?
You sure did.
Karen,
You know,
I have
it's on the
something
other
to
side
add
though
to
with
what you-
testing, I totally got rid of tests in my child development class, which was this huge general education satisfier, 100-person class, and switched over completely to reflective writing. And when I went through my logic model, my first year, I had this great student. I still remember where he was sitting in the class. And he said, Karen, I loved the structure. The reflective writing was so interesting and it was great, but you had so much incredibly important and useful information in lectures. And I felt like I couldn't focus on it because I knew you were never going to ask me to know about it. So maybe you should put in some like really low stakes quizzes every once in a while. And he said, I went to this one class where we had these scratch off exams, scratch off scantrons that they used. So I bought the scratch off scantrons. I put in these random questions right in the lecture, open note, open book. And they would get full credit if they scratched off the correct answer the first time, and they'd get a fraction of a point, going down to a quarter of a point if they got it wrong all 4 times. But that was like the sweet spot for testing, because testing does focus students' attention. Sorry, somebody was just about to speak.
Karen, I just wanted to add 2 or 3 my feedback. Responding to, I think it was Michael's question about cheating. I will sound redundant, but I do think that you mentioned, I do tell them that I can give you an A in the class, but it's really important that you understand the material, blah, blah, blah. But one semester when COVID started, I had some extensive cheating. So I reached out to CTL and we, made some of the things tighter. Like I created a question bank and, people got randomized questions, people had answers randomized. And I think it trickled down to a little bit more negative course evals. And when I mandated the responders monitor, I even tightened it further for them not to be having, different devices and iPads and phones and books. And in one of my courses, actually 3 students moved to another section and told that instructor, oh, Monica has responders browser compulsory. And I work a job where I'm supposed to be available 24/7 and I can't take her class because of the responders monitor. So it was kind of interesting data for me that, when you try to toughen up the areas where students can cheat, in some way it does backfire to the instructor.
Well, also what you're telling those students every time you tell them you can't have your cell phones, you can't do this, you can't do that, is I don't trust you, I don't trust you, I don't trust you. And, sadly, it's true. There's a lot of cheating out there. I feel like all those cheaters will suffer because they are not learning important content. And I think, it goes back to having your logic model. You should only teach students things that are really useful and important to them. You should make a really good case for why they're useful and important. You should structure assignments so that in the long run, cheating isn't going to be helpful to whatever extent you can by counting tests for less and other things for more to whatever extent you can, and by creating open book, open note tests, right? If you think about it, 98% of what we're required to do in life is open book and open note. And so higher ed's obsession with closed book, closed note memorization, the odds that students are going to remember the things they've memorized from you are really low. And if instead you can say, use everything you've got, right? Even use your peers and answer these questions. And, if it's done also through Turnitin or some online automatic plagiarism checker, so they're going to know and they can see ahead of time that it's showing up that they plagiarized, so you put structures in place to limit it. But yeah, in terms of equity and also in terms of preparation for life, over-reliance on testing is not probably the way to go. And trying to tighten our grip as the water slips through our fingers isn't probably the best strategy. I knew we should have scheduled this workshop for 2.5 or 3 hours. Do you remember, Harriet, when we discussed this? I was like, oh, we need more than 2 hours. Everyone's like, 2 hours is a really long time. Okay, so we will send out the slides and we will be in touch. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining.